Welcome to the next in our series of online lectures for Western Civ 2. Today we're going to talk about one of the outcomes of the Industrial Revolution, and that is the development of the philosophy of socialism. Now, as always, there are some key terms that I'd like you to keep track of as you're watching this video, as well as some questions you should be able to answer by the time this lecture is done. So let's get to it. The Industrial Revolution is typically considered to be a good thing in Western civilization. The biggest good that came from it was the ability to mass produce many of the things that people needed: clothing, food, and housing. They were able to produce these things more efficiently and far more cheaply when they did it with machines through the industrial process. Ultimately, this will benefit everyone, from the rich down to the poor. In the short run, however, the Industrial Revolution had some real drawbacks, especially for those at the bottom of society, who were doing most of the work in the factories day after day. At least that's how Alexis de Tocqueville, a French politician and writer, saw it, as he said, quote, "The industrial class, which produces for the pleasures of the greatest number, is itself exposed to miseries that would be almost unknown if this class did not exist." So, what were some of the miseries that de Tocqueville was talking about? As we discussed in class, one of the outcomes of the Industrial Revolution was child labor. Now, let's be clear on this. Children in poor families had been working to support their families for some time. This was nothing new to the Industrial Revolution. However, the nature of child labor in the Industrial Revolution was very, very different. Children often toiled in these factories, sometimes up to 19 hours a day. They were subject to beatings from their supervisors. Young girls were often sexually harassed or even raped. Children could be injured in factory accidents, and if they couldn't work anymore, they received no compensation for that injury. Moreover, many folks started to become concerned that if children are spending 14, 16, 19 hours a day working in a factory, that they didn't have time for school or to be with their families. These became real concerns as the Industrial Revolution moved along. But it wasn't only children who were working under these hellish conditions. Adults also worked long hours for very, very little pay. And like children, they were also often injured on the job, and they received no compensation if they couldn't work after a workplace accident. But the ones who had jobs were the lucky ones. The Industrial Revolution did create jobs, but it also eliminated those jobs in times of economic trouble. This is what is known as a boom and bust cycle. During good times, also known as boom times, factories were kept busy, and anyone who wanted a job could have one. But when the economy went bust, factories closed down and workers lost their jobs. Now think about what that meant. If a worker lost his or her job, that meant they also lost perhaps the only means for supporting their families. They had no money to buy food, no money to buy clothing, or to pay their rent. Families during this time often starved to death or could be forced out of their homes. Another consequence of the Industrial Revolution was urbanization. And again, we talked about this in class. London, for example, grew from a population of about 1 million people in the year 1800 to roughly 2.3 million by 1850. Now, people were moving to the cities where they could find factory jobs. That's why the city populations went up. This meant that, as I said, the populations of many of these cities exploded overnight. Houses and apartment buildings could not be built fast enough to accommodate all of these newcomers. Several families might in fact share a single room. This was dirty and disease-ridden and an incredibly dangerous and difficult environment to live. Finally, another change involved the nature of industrial work. Workers in the early 1800s were accustomed to hard work on farms or in cottage industries. However, work in a factory could be very, very different. Workers in a factory had to punch a time clock. In other words, you worked as long as your boss or your supervisor told you you had to work. If you worked at home on a farm or in a cottage industry, you often could control how long your workday was going to be. That was not the case in a factory. Moreover, factories would employ hundreds of people, if not thousands. In a cottage industry, or if you worked on a farm, you would know everybody you worked with. They would be your family and your neighbors. That was not the case in a factory. Factory work could be highly isolating. People just didn't know one another. They didn't know their coworkers and their colleagues. And yeah, rural workers simply were not accustomed to working in such large numbers. The new industrial work system made life so difficult for many, many people that some people began to argue that they had to do something to correct these problems. Some people began to argue in favor of a new philosophy. That philosophy was known as socialism, and it was born out of a need to protect the new industrial working class. So, what is socialism? In many ways, socialism is an offshoot of the Enlightenment. Most socialists believed in the idea of natural rights. All human beings had certain natural and inalienable rights. That meant they also believed in human equality and the right to choose one's leaders, the right to life and liberty. Now, socialists accept all of these things, but they also argue that there were other rights that people should have as well. Chief amongst those new rights would be the right to work. In short, if government was truly to promote natural rights, it must also provide jobs for the people in tough times. This became especially important with the turbulent boom and bust cycles of the Industrial Revolution. Private industry had no trouble providing jobs during boom times. But when the inevitable bust came, the government needed to step in and provide jobs for the worker. Now, there is also a belief in a right to earn a decent living. In other words, socialists argued that the government should work to ensure that factory workers were being paid enough to support their families. So socialists were in favor of, for example, minimum wage legislation. Later on, socialists are going to be in favor of, for example, compensation for workers injured on the job. Socialists are going to favor things like the 40-hour work week, limiting the number of hours that a worker could work. All of these things that are meant to improve life for the worker, come from socialism. One of the best known of the early socialists was a Frenchman by the name of Louis Blanc. Louis Blanc wrote the book The Organization of Labor. And again, like I said earlier, Louis Blanc endorsed many of the reforms of the Enlightenment, the idea of voting rights, human equality, the right to choose one's leaders, etc., etc., etc. However, he also argued that only when working classes were in power, when they could vote to put their own people in power, could they actually create the necessary reforms that Louis Blanc thought were necessary to protect workers. So, just to repeat this, Louis Blanc favored many of the Enlightenment reforms because he thought that by working through the democratic process, workers would be able to elect their own leaders who would improve life for the working class. One of the ideas that Louis Blanc truly believes in is this notion of social workshops. Social workshops were these organizations that were run and funded by the government. And these social workshops could provide job training for workers who were out of a job, or in some cases they could even provide jobs for the unemployed. So again, this is this idea of a right to work. Blanc also championed the idea of labor organization. Now let me explain what that means. Blanc believed that once workers became accustomed to working together in social workshops, they would also gravitate toward other types of organization. We're talking about labor unions here. Now that may not seem radical to us, the idea that workers could join a union is really kind of a common part of our society today. That was not the case back then. Workers back then could be jailed for belonging to a union. You could be arrested for organizing a strike. Blanc, on the other hand, argues that labor had a right to organize. And so again, this is another natural right that many folks in the Enlightenment had not considered. This is what distinguishes socialism from those ideas of the Enlightenment. But not everyone followed the moderate path of Louis Blanc. Some argued for a far more radical action. Two of those radical socialists were Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Marx and Engels advocated violent revolution. They argued that instead of simply working through the democratic process, the working class must rise up and seize power for itself in a violent revolution. Marx and Engels believed that this revolution was inevitable. They argued that working conditions would someday become so bad that workers would someday just rise up and spontaneously destroy the factory owners, the politicians who protected the factory owners, and really just the rich in general. Now think about it. I don't think you should be surprised that these ideas made Marx and Engels very unpopular in their homeland of Germany, and actually made them very unpopular among the property-owning and factory-owning classes all across Europe. So, in conclusion, the Industrial Revolution does bring about some welcome changes in society. Again, cheaper manufactured goods have made life easier and better for all of us. However, it also changed the nature of work. And to protect workers from these changes, socialists and other reformers are going to come along and try to advocate some sort of reform, again, to improve life for workers. Government should step in to make sure that the workers' rights not only to vote or to participate in government, but also to have a job, to belong to a union, to ensure that these rights also were protected. And once again, in conclusion, socialists did not agree on the best way to accomplish these things. Moderate socialists like Louis Blanc believed it should be done through the ballot process, through democracy. That was the best way to achieve some sort of a change or to protect workers. And again, he was far more moderate. Radical socialists, on the other hand, like Marx and Engels, argued in favor of a violent revolution. So anyway, in conclusion, I hope you understand, first of all, how the Industrial Revolution is changing Western civilization. But I also hope that you're seeing how socialists are responding to those changes and trying to improve life for the working class.